Day 2 of the conference, bright and early. Thank you for being here. So first off, we just want to highlight some things from yesterday. It was an exciting and vibrant day with lots of crafts and tutorials, paper presentations, and a fabulous keynote from Alondra Nelson with a lot of really interesting questions and dialogue that really engage with the subject of the talk. So really appreciate everyone for being so engaged. This afternoon, we have a couple of highlights, or across the day, we have a couple of highlights. We have, in addition to this morning opening keynote, we also have an afternoon keynote with Dr. Hannah, Brooke Hansen, Krista Pulowski, and Crystal Kaufman. And this will be a kind of panel dialogue style session. And then we also have an evening play that is making its premiere at 7 p.m. here in this room. It's written by one of our program chairs, Jessica Holman and Andrew Gelman, so be sure to join us for that. Do you want to take this?
So this is just a friendly reminder about our paper sessions. We have lots of paper sessions, and there are many papers in the paper sessions. In order to ensure that those sessions move smoothly and that there are not delays, we've asked that paper presenters submit their slides beforehand. Please, if you absolutely need to update a slide, go as early as you can to the speaker ready desk, which is in 193B, and update the slides. And please be cognizant of the time limits, both as session chairs and the speakers in the paper panels. Do remember that because we're constrained in the number of hours that we have the rooms, if a paper session runs late, that has the effect of crunching other people in their paper session. So the effect of not abiding or not following the time limits is to inconvenience other people, and so we hope we can avoid doing that. Do you want also? I'll tell you. Today in particular is a very long day. We're starting at 8:30, and we're not finishing with including the play until after 8:30, maybe 9 o'clock this evening. And we're encouraging people to be very cognizant of their physical and mental health during the day, taking breaks, making sure that you're doing the things that you're interested in, but then also coming back and engaging when you have the energy to do so. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Ziad, to come up. So I have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Ziad Obermeyer. As he walks up, I'll start the introduction. I was just talking to Ziad outside. I think I've known Ziad for about 10 years. He's one of the most insightful researchers I've ever met. And Ziad was trained as an emergency doctor, and he still gets away as often as he can to a hospital in rural Arizona to work in the ER. And these days, he also spends most of his time on research and teaching at Berkeley. Inspired by his clinical practice, he builds machine learning algorithms that help doctors make better decisions. He also studies where algorithms can go wrong and how to fix them, and his work on algorithmic bias has been highly influential both in public debate about algorithms and in regulatory oversight and civil investigations. And he's also a Chan Zuckerberg BioHub investigator, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and has been named an emerging leader by the National Academy of Medicine. His work has won numerous awards and appeared in a wide range of journals: Science, Nature Medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine, leading computer science conferences, including this one, I guess. He's a co-founder of the Nightingale Open Science, a nonprofit that makes massive new medical imaging data sets available for research, and Dandelion, a platform for AI innovation in health. And before Berkeley, he was also an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and a consultant at McKinsey. Thank you. I'm very lucky to have Ziad. I'm looking forward to Ziad's talk. Let's welcome Ziad.
Thank you so much, Chen Hao. It's really an honor to be here, and it's also pretty surprising for me to be here, given that I'm fairly confident that I know less about algorithmic fairness, accountability, and transparency than almost anyone in this room. And I think this comes from the fact that, sorry. I'm just pressing the button, but if you could, thank you. When a few years ago, we wrote a paper that turned out to be a paper about racial bias in a very widely deployed algorithm. But interestingly, we didn't really set out to write a paper about bias. We set out to write a paper about a real problem that a lot of hospitals were facing. So hospitals have a population that they're responsible for, and they just give me a thumbs up when I can keep going. Thanks. So hospitals have this problem that they're responsible for a population of patients, and they need to figure out which patients are going to get sick. And that's a really good thing for hospitals to do. It's a great use of machine learning, predicting what's going to happen to a particular patient. And we were interested in helping hospitals do that better. Now, that turned into a paper about algorithmic bias because of what we found, but we didn't set out to write that paper. I think the file is called Obermeyer FAccT', something like that. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Thank you. That paper, despite not being initially a paper about bias, ended up having a large set of impacts, I think because it turned out to be one of the few empirical papers on bias in very widely deployed algorithms in health. And so it prompted the New York State insurance regulator to investigate the maker of that algorithm. It prompted the FTC to issue guidance to companies. A couple of senators wrote a lot of strongly worded letters. The California Attorney General's office started investigations. So this was all great, but also deeply surprising, because again, this wasn't really supposed to be a paper about bias. And so what I thought I'd do is try to make sense of how I got here to be standing in front of all of you, which I don't really deserve. But I'll try to reflect on where that came from and what the components of this paper were that allowed it to be impactful in the way that it was. And I think if I had to distill down to what the secret sauce of that analysis was, it was that a lot of people were building algorithms in health, and I think a lot of people are building algorithms in a lot of different parts of society, where those algorithms are viewed as kind of pure data products, in the sense that they're made by teams of people who are deeply immersed in the realities of a data set, who need to build a product. But a lot of the critical insights that you need to do that job actually don't live in the data. They live outside of the data set. And it's very, very easy for those two worlds to coexist totally separately and in isolation from each other. And I think that that is very dangerous. And so I think that as dangerous, so being deeply immersed in the data set is good, but at some point you have to step back and think about the broader implications of what you're doing, where this data comes from, how do I account for the biases in this data? And I think it's equally dangerous to be living purely outside of the data set. And I say this as someone who, so my training is as a doctor, and I think even though, medicine is theoretically a data-driven field, anyone who's interacted with the medical system also knows that it's like, if it's data-driven, it's like drunk driving or some bad form of driving. And so, my own training, I think, prepared me to know a lot about this one particular domain, but I think it didn't really prepare me to do the kind of work that I ended up doing. And I think that that's a commentary on the way our education and training programs produce people. We tend to produce people that either live inside of data sets or outside of data sets, and not people who can bridge that gap. And the people who do, and I think a lot of the people in this room probably fit that description, I think are really, really important for driving the crosstalk that I think is a huge opportunity to do great work in this field. So I'll talk about 3 things today. One is just a few examples of the danger of living on either side of that divide exclusively. And then I'll try to switch gears to some more positive examples of progress that comes from crosstalk from inside and outside the data set. And then finally, I'll talk about what I think of as a huge obstacle to this kind of work, and actually one of the things that I was very, very lucky to benefit from in doing some of the early work that I did in this area, which is access to data. Okay, so to recap the work on algorithmic bias in these population health management products, the data scientist who's building these products has a problem. And that problem is there's a huge data set of patients, and some of them are going to get sick. And the data scientist's charge is to build a product that's going to find who is going to get sick so that the health system can intervene proactively and help those people. And I think I'll just pause here and say that one of the luxuries of working on machine learning in health, as opposed to criminal justice or finance or other places, is that a lot of machine learning as it interacts with society is about targeting people. And often, in a lot of other fields, targeting people who don't have good credit or who are at high likelihood of criminality, a word with a very loaded definition. Whereas in health, largely when we are targeting people, we're doing it so we can help, so we can deliver extra resources, so we can get people more care that they need. And so I think at least one of the things I've realized from interacting with scholars who are working in other fields is that health is quite special in that regard. And I think it's one of the reasons that I'm more optimistic than most about the potential for machine learning in this particular field, because the purpose of machine learning is actually to help rather than to exclude or marginalize. So this is, I think, one of those examples. This is a good thing for health systems to be doing. We know that some people get sick more than others. We know that they have less access to care. We'd like to get them access to more care. But to do that, we have to find them. And so this is the use of machine learning in this setting, finding people who are going to get sick. But the data scientist's problem is that there's no variable in the data set that's called sick or get sick. There's just a bunch of variables about like the kidney and the lungs and like some other stuff. And some people find this interesting, but when you gotta build this thing and get it out the door, you don't find this interesting. You find this deeply annoying, because now it's like, wait, I have to like learn about the kidney to build my stupid algorithm? This doesn't make any sense. And so I think that's a real problem, is that the people who are making a bunch of the decisions about the data, how it's processed, who's selected, who's not, how the variables get constructed, they can be people who actually like don't have the tools that they need to make those decisions that turn out to be really, really consequential, as we'll see. And so the solution that not just the data scientist at the company whose product we studied, but basically every single company making similar products in the healthcare system for this purpose. And the industry estimates this is like used for about 150 million people every year to like screen them for access to healthcare. So it's like the majority of the US population is being run through one of these algorithms that works like this. And what do I mean by like this? Well, instead of dealing with all of this messiness about the kidney and the liver and things like that, you use one variable, which has a number of very attractive properties. You use a variable called total healthcare costs as your measure of sickness. And I think there's some face validity to that. When you get sick, you tend to generate costs. That happens for everybody. And the other benefit of that variable is that it's very easy to clean. You do not need to know anything about physiology or illness to know that this is a good variable. When it's missing, it's 0, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is the choice that a lot of data scientists made when building these products. And so I think that a lot of the people who did this were actually like, they were very live to the issue that there could be racial bias built into the tools that they were building. So in this particular case, they actually did run some calibration checks. So you can pick whichever fairness metric you want. This one is just basically realized costs over the year after the algorithm made its prediction against the algorithm score on the x-axis. You can see those lines, and the lines are for black patients and white patients. The other, and this is, I should clarify, this is the self-reported identity that people give when they encounter the healthcare system and they're forced to fill out a bunch of forms. These are checkboxes that are defined by the health system, so they're not perfect, but this is what we have. And the other groups were too small to give very reliable estimates, which is another problem that comes up a lot in doing empirical work. But with all of those things in mind, you can see that the black and the white lines are actually pretty overlapping. So there's not a lot of difference in the performance of this algorithm for predicting cost. And that's good. So the algorithm, at least on this metric, doesn't appear to have a big bias problem. And you could pat yourself on the back and say, well, it's probably because I didn't use the race variable or the zip code variables. And I've heard that if I don't use those variables, then my algorithm can't be biased. So that's good. And now I can get to the business of using this algorithm to do what it's meant to do, which is to allocate resources to the people who need it most. In other words, the people at highest risk. And I think that illustrates a really profound disconnect between in the data set and outside the data set. Because in the data set, we know that the algorithm is predicting cost. And we know that those predictions are going to be used as a measure of needs. Help is going to be allocated to these people proportional to their risk. But risk is just cost. So that's all known in the data set by design. And on the other hand, outside of the data set, we also know these facts about our healthcare system, which is that some patients get worse access to care. And when they do manage to access care, they get worse treatments. And all of those things are actually known by everyone involved. The data scientists know these facts. They built the algorithm. They also work in the healthcare system that everybody knows is not fair. But more importantly, the people who bought this algorithm, who are, having met these people and talked to a lot of these people since doing this work, these are people with deep commitments to equity and health and helping and finding the most vulnerable populations. These people also knew both of these facts. The fact that this was a cost predictor was not buried. It was very transparent. The doctors who were presented with the algorithm's recommendations and asked to verify them and fast track some people and not others into the extra help program, they also knew that. So everybody knew all of these facts, but the facts were living in two completely separate silos and were not connected, which is, I think, really tragic, because once you do connect these facts, it's very obvious. So instead of ranking people by their algorithm score on the x-axis, now we're ranking them by their measured chronic condition burden. And on the y-axis, again, we have cost. And here you can see that these lines are not at all overlapping. So conditional on measured health conditions, white patients have far higher costs than black patients, about $1,000 on average per year, because of all of these barriers to access and differences in treatment that black patients face. Again, this was not a new fact. It just hadn't been connected to what the algorithm was doing. So when you have black patients whose costs are lower, conditional on their measured health, it means that if you're unbiased for predicting cost, you're going to be biased for predicting health. And that's exactly what happened. So whatever measure of health you look at, whether you look at blood pressure, measures of diabetic control, whatever, at the same score and given the same priority for access to extra help with their health, black patients are far less healthy, with mortality differences at the same algorithm threshold on the order of like 10 to 30%. So these are not subtle differences in health, but the algorithm is viewing them the same way because the algorithm is accurately predicting that they'll have the same cost. So this is what we called, coming out of this empirical exercise, label choice bias. So essentially, the bias in this case was not caused by a lot of the usual suspects in the literature. Using race as a predictor, this algorithm did not. Underrepresentation of key groups in the training data. It was actually quite a diverse training data when we looked at it later. And it also, importantly, was not the result of deliberate trade-offs in design. I think one response that a lot of people had to this paper is like, well, of course they're predicting cost. Insurance companies just, they want to save costs. But if you're the insurance company, the best way to save costs is not to target the highest cost people. It's to target the highest avoidable cost people. Who are those people? They're the ones who lack access to primary care and whose heart failure flares up, they end up in the ER, they get admitted to the hospital. So everyone's incentives were aligned here. This was just an error. It was the result of the choice of the label, the question that we asked the algorithm to answer. And I think this connects to a lot of really interesting literature on how we ask the question, how we formulate the problem, and what values we use when we do formulate those problems. This is very widespread, I think, not just in health, in the sense that we often want algorithms to do things that we as humans can talk about with a lot of facility, like find people with poor health or low creditworthiness or criminality. But those abstract concepts from outside the data set can get very, very distorted by the realities of what's measured and what's not. And I think without crosstalk between people who are in and outside of the data set, it's very, very hard to see these problems. Again, had you just looked at bias for predicting cost, you would have found very little bias. But when you looked at it for its true purpose, which is finding people who need help, that's when the bias really starts to pop off the page. We did a lot of follow-up work after this article with health systems, state agencies, tech companies who are building algorithms, and then a lot of law enforcement work as well, where we found that these biases were glass half empty, very widespread, and affected a lot of the algorithms that we were asked to evaluate and that we wanted to evaluate in the healthcare system. From everything from triaging patients in the ER to the back-end operational systems of the clinic, predicting who's not going to show up to a clinic appointment. But in all of these cases, I think after doing a lot of work around the purpose of the algorithm, figuring out how to fix it, what its intended purpose was, how to make sure that we weren't excluding the most vulnerable patients, in a lot of these cases, we found that the algorithm could be retrained in that same data set on different labels that were better and more aligned with what the algorithm was supposed to be doing, which was helping people with their health. So I think that's a cautionary tale about how living only in the data set can be dangerous. But I think this also works both ways. And I think that engaging with empirical analyses can also really deepen and strengthen the insights that we get from outside of the data set. And I think one example of this is physicians and historians and social scientists are increasingly live to this issue of race corrections in clinical algorithms. So, the most widespread version of this is the kidney function test, but this is now, I think, a live issue in lots and lots of different parts of medicine. And I think that the solution that has not just been proposed, but is now increasingly being implemented, is to remove race corrections from all of these algorithms. And I think that, just theoretically, that is going to increase access to some things. So removing that correction is going to make more Black patients, for example, eligible for kidney transplants. On the other hand, that same correction, or removal of the correction, is going to make a lot of Black patients less eligible for potentially life-saving medications that depend on kidney function. And so theoretically, it's not totally clear how these things balance out. And so, I think a really important question to ask that a lot of people are now starting to ask is, well, what actually happens in the data when we remove these race corrections or include them? And so I'm going to give you one fact from an analysis that's led by Anna Zink, who's a postdoc at Chicago, who's fantastic, as well as Emma Pearson, around cancer screening. So a lot of the way that we prioritize cancer screening, from mammograms to colorectal cancer, is based on a variable called family history. But families are not all the same. And some families have historically not been afforded access to diagnosis and screening technologies. And so that variable called family history means something very, very different depending on which family you happen to be part of. And so what we show in a very large and very diverse cohort study of colorectal cancer is that it would actually be not very good to remove a race correction from cancer screening algorithms for the following reason. You can see from the graph, which is colorectal cancer incidence against age by race and by family history. So what you can see is that for white patients on the left, family history dramatically increases the risk of developing colorectal cancer. Whereas for black patients, there is no difference between patients who do and don't have a family history. Why is that? Well, it's because that variable doesn't mean as much when your family has historically lacked access to diagnosis. And so if you, as a doctor, see a black patient versus a white patient who doesn't have any family history of breast cancer, you should interpret that very, very differently because one person's family has been lucky and another person's family has not. And so I think this is a case where if you removed a race correction from these screening algorithms, you would decrease access to screening for black patients because you'd be getting the average effect of family history and not a tailored effect that can be interpreted by race. So this is not to say that we always want race corrections or that we always don't, but just that these empirical analyses can really deepen our understanding of both the problem and the solution. So I want to move on to how crosstalk can actually drive progress. And I'll just talk through two brief case studies of things that I'm particularly interested in because they're things that are currently largely invisible to data scientists, but that I think with the right analytic methods, we can expose some of these really important and unevenly distributed burdens that we're currently not measuring. And I think that the two examples that I want to walk through are pain and fatigue. And I think both of these things are really hard to study because they're poorly measured, but they also have very deeply unfair impacts, as I'll show. So here's another data scientist. I think one area that I'm very, very optimistic about in medicine is the prospect of using algorithms to meaningfully process high-dimensional data like electrocardiogram waveforms or radiology images. And I think that's because these things just don't fit in our traditional statistical models, but they are really, really important for the practice of medicine and as sources of information that humans are unlikely to be fully processing. And so I think I'm very optimistic about this. But the way this is typically done is largely, okay, well, how do we train an algorithm to read an X-ray? Well, we need to give the algorithm a source of truth. And so what is the source of truth? What are we training the algorithm to predict? Well, this is the current state of the art. We're training it to do this. And so if you look at most of the literature, so we're going to use knee arthritis as our example. What most of these algorithms are doing is just replicating human judgment. And so you're predicting the interpretation of the radiologist or the decision of the orthopedist to do a knee replacement or all these things about human judgment. Insight from outside the data set, where do these human labels come from? Well, they're objective grading scales that are based on the X-ray appearance. And the most commonly used one was developed by these two doctors. And these two doctors were studying coal miners in England in the 1940s and 50s. And when you go back to those original studies, they don't even mention the, what the demographics of that population look like because they were all the same. And so this is work that was also led by Emma Pearson, who's really wonderful, and I think a great example of someone who is able to think both very deeply inside the data and outside the data. Instead of training the algorithm to replicate what the radiologist says, we found a different target. We asked another human whose opinion is quite important to take into account, which is not the doctor, but the patient. So we trained the algorithm not to replicate the doctor's opinion, but to learn from the patient's experience of pain. And I think, there's a lot of worry about this variable of pain because it's like, oh, it's so subjective, it's so noisy. It's as much a reflection of which side of the bed the patient got up on this morning than it is about anything. But we can predict it using just the pixels of the knee X-ray. And so there's something there. It's not noise. It's not random. There's something in the knee that is predicting a patient's experience of pain in that knee. And I think that doing that illuminates these sources of pain that I think were previously invisible, as manifested by this fact from the literature, which is that Black patients report more pain in the knee, not just unconditionally, but conditional on the appearance of the X-ray. So these studies take patients who radiologists have looked at their X-rays and graded in exactly the same way, and they find that Black patients report much more pain. And I think this is one part of a hugely uneven distribution of pain in society in general. When you look at surveys that ask, have you been in severe pain over the past 2 or 3 days, the rate at which Black patients answer yes is twice that of white patients. So when you think of all of the inequalities in our society, this is one that I think is hugely important for someone's everyday life, their experience of the world, their relationships with other people. Anyone who's had back pain or another kind of pain, it just distorts everything. And this is something that's twice as common, but very underattended to, I think, because we have such poor measures of it. So here, even when the knee looks the same to the radiologist, Black patients are reporting more pain. Why is that? Well, one explanation is like things outside the knee, things in society. But another explanation is that there's just stuff in the knee that doctors are missing, because our definitions of what's in the knee are shaped by these populations of white male coal miners that are not at all reflective of the populations that doctors see in their offices today. And when we did the simulations of whether, how this would affect access to knee replacement surgery, it would double the fraction of Black patients who were eligible for knee replacement surgery if you graded the severity of their knee problem with the algorithm rather than by the doctor. Okay, here's the mirror image of an insight, coming from outside the data set. And this is my insight. And it's not a very important insight, but I was reflecting on it as I was finishing my slides and adjusting them this morning. Sorry, Aziz. Which is that I don't think very clearly when I'm tired. And sometimes that results in not giving a very good talk. But sometimes I think it seems likely that results in some form of worse patient care. And yet, to date, when people have looked at the effect of working an overnight shift or whatever on patient outcomes, we haven't found it. And that's why doctors still work pretty terrible hours, despite some of the reforms that have been instituted over the past few years. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that our measures of fatigue and our outcomes that we look at are extremely coarse. We're looking at do patients die more after you've worked an overnight shift? But it's a rare event. Not everybody who works an overnight shift is tired. So the resolution on these analyses is very low. And so one insight, and this is work that's being led by a fantastic PhD student at Chicago, one of Chen Hao's PhD students, Joe Xu, is that doctors are writing notes about their patients all the time. But those notes are also about the doctors. And those notes specifically can reveal a lot about the doctor's mental state. And so what we do is we train an algorithm to detect fatigue. And the basic assumption is that I'm writing a note about a patient today. If I can predict how many days I've worked over the past week, whether it's been a really tiring week or a really light week for me, that has nothing to do with the note that I'm writing today, apart from me being tired. And so we basically just take 2 doctors, and we count how many shifts they worked over the past week, and we predict that with features of the note. And it turns out that we can predict that. So there is a signature of that measure of fatigue, and it correlates to a lot of other things where we think doctors might be fatigued, like working overnight versus working in the morning. It also correlates to the quality of doctors' testing decisions when they're testing patients for heart attack. So this is also a patient outcome-focused issue. What are the things that indicate fatigue in the note? Well, doctors tend to write lower complexity notes, more predictable notes when they're tired. They have higher affect in general, more affective words, and particularly more anger. And when you look at the tiredness score, the predicted tiredness by race, you find that there are huge average differences in the notes that doctors write. Doctors appear to be more tired when they're writing about non-white patients. And if you look at the black-white coefficient difference, that's about 20% of the effect size of working an overnight shift versus working in the morning. So not trivial differences in the, so I don't know what this is, but I think this is a really interesting empirical puzzle to start figuring out now that we have a measure of who's fatigued and when. Okay, so I want to close by talking about what I view as a major obstacle to doing this work, which is data. So I was very, very lucky when we started looking at that initial algorithm. I was working at a hospital that gave me access to the data that I needed to get the algorithm score and the health outcomes on which to evaluate it. And I was extremely lucky, but most people are not so lucky. And I think that's a huge reason why a lot of this work is not being done, despite the fact that there are a lot of algorithms out there that need to be audited because they're probably deeply biased. Getting data is incredibly hard. There are gatekeepers inside the health system that are, in part looking out for patient privacy and trying to do the right thing, but there are also just a lot of other barriers to using data for these kinds of analyses. The data are occasionally also, just bought by tech companies, but they're not that interested in sharing the data either. And for everyone else, the data access is either inefficient, involving years-long processes to get, the data use agreement signed, then you have to go get your fingerprints and your criminal background check. And it's like, look, I just want to run a regression. I don't know why I have to get my fingerprints taken, but that's the current state. It's also deeply unfair. If you're at a well-resourced institution that has the data already up online and all of this infrastructure streamlined, you're much more likely to be able to do these analyses than others. So that's a huge problem because these data, I think, are a public good that have enormous value. They have enormous value just because of all of the insights locked into them, but there's also another reason that they're a public good, which is that we all pay for these data to be created. We all pay taxes that go to Medicare. We all pay insurance premia that lead to everyone else's data being created. So this is all of our data. And I totally understand that there are privacy and agency concerns that absolutely need to be respected. But the opportunity cost of not using these data is huge. For example, sudden cardiac death. It's exactly what it sounds like. People just drop dead. Totally unpredictable, which is why people still drop dead, despite the fact that we have a preventative measure, which is implanting a defibrillator. So if we knew who was going to drop dead, we could implant a defibrillator in them and save some fraction of these lives. I'm working on a project on this exact topic, and I'm very conscious of the fact that every month that I delay the analysis and that this work is getting done more slowly than I'd like, there are some preventable deaths that might be, that might be preventable. And I think getting more people access to build tools like this to diagnose cancer early, to understand who's at risk for long COVID and try to enroll those people in clinical trials to prevent it. These things are hugely valuable, and they're not getting done right now. And it's really hard to see things that aren't getting done. But there's a huge cost to not using these data. There's another huge cost, which is that the algorithm that we studied, the specific algorithm we studied, is being used for screening of 70 million people every year. That's just one algorithm. The rest of them, the total 150 million people, as I mentioned. There are a lot of other algorithms that are very widely used out there that haven't been audited, where we don't know what the problems are. And I think this is a problem not just for the academic research community who wants to get access to the data to run these audit studies. It's also a big problem for the FDA. It's very, very hard for the FDA to insist on rigorous external validation of algorithms because how are people going to get the data? And so right now we're in this, what I view as a fairly unsafe regulatory environment driven by the fact that it's really, really hard for people to get access to data. And at the same time, the FDA is seeing all of this innovation, some of it which could be good, some of it which could be bad. So I think a lot of this is created by the lack of data. And I wanted to tell you about one last thing that I'm working on, which is a very applied effort, which is a platform that collects data from a handful of large non-academic health systems in the US. So we partner with 5 systems that are chosen specifically for diversity of population, geography, care models, equipment, like the medical equipment that we're using. And we de-identify that data and bring it over to a data platform where it can be accessed. And this is a company called Dandelion, and I am a co-founder of this company. I hold equity, so I am deeply conflicted in presenting you information about this company. But I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because I think it's important. Once that data gets out of the healthcare system, we keep it on the platform. It never leaves, and access can be given to people who want to build clinical diagnostics or to do other things with the data. For example, a free public algorithm audit service that we're currently building with support from the Moore Foundation. So basically, anyone, and that's anyone in this room, but anyone who's developing a medical algorithm, starting with electrocardiograms, but moving on to other modalities, can upload an algorithm into a secure environment. We will run it on our data, on whatever evaluation label they choose, and then we'll provide a report that gives them and regulators information about the overall performance of that algorithm and the equity of that algorithm across key groups. And they'll get back a report like this that will actually just tell them how it's doing. And I think this is really important, because if you're using data from the Mayo Clinic from patients in Rochester, Minnesota, it is really, really hard for you to know how that algorithm is doing in Atlanta or in Southern California or in Texas. And I think that is a really, really critical input to algorithmic accountability and oversight, both from our academic community, but also from the FDA. It's, the world is full of trade-offs, and I think that I had a hard time just thinking about what the principles were for using patient data in this way. And so I'll just share with you how we ended up thinking about them. Anything that we or anyone else does with these data need to benefit the patients whose data we're using. And so we as a company review every single use case that's being proposed for these data, and the hospitals also review it. And no projects without direct benefit to patients are going to be approved. We also provide strict privacy protections, so there's de-identification of the data, whatever that means under the law, as one layer, but not the only layer. The data are held in an environment with no egress and detailed logs, and there are draconian penalties for doing anything with the data that you're not supposed to do. So I want to close by just saying that I have worked a lot on trying to solve real problems in real data, and that brings a lot of trade-offs. Finding better proxies that aren't perfect, figuring out the best way to get biased algorithms out of being used, which sometimes requires working with the companies that build those algorithms, convincing hospitals to share data in the context of a system where hospitals are incentivized based on revenue and not really on patient outcomes. All of these things are really difficult, and I've struggled with them a lot. But I think engaging with those problems has 2 benefits. One is that it provides a lot of new research insights, some of them very technical that can be taken out of a particular data set and generalized. And I think it also, at least for me, has brought a lot of satisfaction, because when you're contributing to solving those problems, you're often in the room where decisions are getting made, and you can bend those decisions in the right direction. And so it's been really a privilege for me to be engaged in solving some of these problems with people who have the ability to solve them. I have no idea how we're doing on time, but I'm happy to do questions if we have time for them, and thank you so much.
think we have plenty of time for Q&A, and there are 2 mics in this room. If you have questions in person, please come up to the room, and we'll start with a hopping question. Chacha, do you want to come and ask that question? You can bring your laptop and read it out.
The first question is asked by Sarah Simon. Sarah asks question that I quote, "Thank you for your talk. I'll try to ask this question with much grace as possible. Is predictive AI in healthcare a distraction? We know what makes at-risk populations healthier is housing, social service, free access to sustained care in a community, etc. You said you don't think very clearly when you are tired. Why not spend resources, say, making sure hospitals address physician burnout and enforce safe nursing staffing ratios? Why put academic band-aids on these problems?"
Yeah, so I think I appreciate the question because I think it highlights that hospitals and clinical medicine operate within a very, very complex and flawed system where, yes, patients often don't have housing. They often lack a lot of the things that they need to make them healthy, and all of that is deeply unfair. I think that noticing and acting on that unfairness in society is actually something that I'm not sure hospitals should be doing. Hospitals produce health by testing patients and by treating them. And that is what we are trained to do. That's what we know how to do. And so I think that clinical medicine is really, really important, and it's an important force for equity in society. The large majority of diseases that are being treated are occurring in the most disadvantaged part of the population, and I think treating those diseases is really important, and I think anyone who has had a loved one who's ill, not detracting from any of the broader social forces that might have contributed to that illness, also really wants that illness to be treated. And so I think that that's where I'm very optimistic that algorithms can improve the process of diagnosing and treating those things. I don't necessarily view that as a distraction to the broader mission of hospitals to promote health and safety. I think that is the thing that hospitals know how to do that I think we can help them do better. I think hospitals are not necessarily the best actors in society to produce housing. I don't think that's something doctors are trained to do. I don't think that's something that hospital administrators are particularly good at. And so I think that hospitals should absolutely work with people who know how to do those things. But hospitals have a comparative advantage in the diagnosis and treatment of disease. And I think that is where machine learning is going to be really transformative.
Hi, I'm Maike Zeliger from Zalando Research in Germany. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit on the, the two, well, I should probably have formulated my question a bit better. Anyway, so what I see in using machine learning methods in medicine is, what machine learning methods do is to go towards some sort of majority distribution and predicting things that are based on some sort of this, statistical distribution that is not really an individual case. And I was wondering, can you say something about this two-sided problem, or so, that you cannot actually do individual treatment with algorithms? And have you done any research in that direction, or how do you see this, conflicting goals?
Yeah, I mean, for all of medicine's efforts today to be very personalized, I think that the way that we make decisions is often very coarse. And so, when a patient comes into the emergency room with chest pain, there are 5 variables that I'm supposed to take into account. But I don't think anyone really believes that heart attack is as simple as 5 variables with integer weights. And so I think that right now we're in a state that I think is guilty of the charge that you bring, which is that we're doing a lot of averages and we're treating a lot of people the same way. And I view machine learning as a way to actually do a lot more personalization by taking into account a lot more of what makes each individual patient special. So of course, we have to learn about the patient in front of you from lots of other patients, but the vocabulary that we can now use to learn about individual patients is much richer than the one that we currently have, even though we're still in the business of generalizing from one patient to the other.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jake Thibault Speaker from the University of Wisconsin. I was curious, you talked a little bit about inside the data versus outside the data. And a different sort of frame on that is sort of objective versus social metrics. And I was wondering how you think about, or how you could teach other people to think about that translation point from sort of the sort of empiricals, medicals, operationalization to something that's real for people.
Yeah, I find this hard to think about because I think on the one hand, I think there are definitely some elements of the objective-subjective distinction, but I think a lot of what historians do is actually like quite objective. So much of social science is actually deeply objective under many definitions of objectivity. And so I think that for me, it's, whether you're looking at one case or many, many cases, is more a question of how deep can you go? How much data can you collect about the things that you're doing? And how do I communicate the results with other people? So do I communicate the results by showing aggregates that try to discover some general thing over time, or do I try to do it with a deeply and well-reasoned story that points to objective facts? And so I think working at scale versus working in individual cases is maybe the way that I think about kind of the techniques and the mindset that are required. And I think that getting the social and historical insights into data and getting those social historical insights out of the data is what I mean by translation. And I think that both directions of that flow is very valuable. Hey.
Is this working? Maybe? Okay. Yeah, so there, perfect. Okay. Always excited to see the way you're using research to solve real problems. There is a potential tension that I see. So in the first section of the talk, talking about in the data, out of the data, and bringing those communities together, and I very much have experienced this in my own work. The best products are built when you're able to kind of get those perspectives working collaboratively to build solutions to problems. And then later in the talk, talking about a part of the immediate need is access to data and getting more of these technically trained experts to work with the data. So I would say really scaling up the in the data community. And in a little bit of our work, we work with like 4 to 5 med students a year to scale up like the folks out of the data able to bridge, but that's very slow, very slow, very time intensive. So I think in medicine, we have seen large data sets become publicly available. There's the MIMIC data sets, thousands of people work with these data sets, and I would say classically in the data, you don't actually get a lot of real products built by that community just working with available data sets. So I am curious, as the work progresses and you're able to bring in the technical experts in the data, how do you think about scaling up the engagement of the communities outside of the data? So the frontline clinicians, the patients, because I can imagine if that doesn't happen in tandem, that we could see ourselves with a lot more solutions built with bias outcome labels or solutions built without those bridges.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really great points. I think two quick reactions. One is that right now, data are so limited that a lot of the questions that people can ask start with the data, like what data are available, rather than asking, what are the important problems that I want to work on, and then how do I get the data to solve that problem? And I think that's because, you know, it's an accident that the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Boston agreed to put all of its ICU data online because there was one set of people who pushed really hard to make that happen. That's why Mimic exists. It's not like we chose, oh, this Boston ICU would be a great place to write all of our medical papers. No, it was just like luck. But that's why we have a lot of, you know, ICU papers. It's just because, so the data right now is really shaping the questions that can be asked, and it's shaping the populations that we can ask those questions in. And so, you know, the problems that a patient in the Beth Israel Deaconess ICU faces is very different from the problems that people face around the country and around the world. And I think that's a huge problem. And so I think that it's really, really important, and I've worked on this both on the for-profit side and on the nonprofit side, with a nonprofit called Nightingale Open Science that puts, you know, de-identified data sets online. We really made an effort to get county hospitals with underdiagnosed heart disease that really wanted to diagnose their heart disease. A lot of other settings around the world where the data could allow people to ask questions that were more in line with the problems that the world population faces rather than patients admitted to the particular ICU where we happen to have data. I think on the getting clinicians and kind of non-technical people involved, I mean, you're a great example of this. I think med school and you know, a lot of other training programs that give you a really important skill set in the world do not prepare you to do the technical work. I'm pretty sure I knew less math after medical school than I knew before medical school. And I think that is a huge problem, and it illustrates the need for training programs that take that start with that amazing skill set that doctors and other practitioners have and teach them how to translate that into data. And I think equally needed is places for people who are in the data, who come up from technical fields, to learn a lot about a particular domain and spend time figuring out what questions are important, how do I answer them, and things like that. So I don't have a great answer, but I think given the way medicine, everyone knows medicine and other fields is going to look in 20 years, we really need a lot of people from both sides of those, from both sides of the fence, making deep investments in the other side. And right now it's being done in an ad hoc way by people like you. So,
thank you.
In the interest of time, let's take two more questions, one from Hopin and another from Julia. And thanks for others who line up and ask questions. And I think Ziad will have some time after the talk as well. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, another anonymous question from Hopin. How do we expand these algorithms internationally, particularly considering data and the differences in data laws?
Yeah, so everything that I've told you so far is using data from the US, and I think that introduces its own biases into the questions that we ask and the products that we that we create. I think that data here is also the key. So I think that right now, that's the biggest roadblock. Why don't we have products that serve the needs of patients in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa? It's because we have no data that would let us either build products or even just validate products that are built elsewhere. So I think that because human physiology has a lot of commonalities across lots of different places, I actually am not totally pessimistic that things built in one place can transfer over to other places, but I think we really need the data to explore that claim, see where these things generalize and see where they don't. And I think one nice thing about this is that if that's true, and it's a big if, we don't need huge data sets in different parts of the world. We just need small data sets to test whether or not these tools from elsewhere are working, or maybe to fine-tune a model that's trained elsewhere. So I think there's an increasingly exciting set of technical tools built on the foundation of lots and lots of data from one place that let you generalize to another place. But a really, really important thing is just testing that and kicking the tires on whether that generalization happens and how well it happens.
Hi, I'm Julia Stojanovic from NYU. Thank you for your work and for your wonderful talk, really insightful. So a quick comment is that I'm from the data management community within computer science, and I'd love to talk about some ways to secure better access to data. But my question is about predicting fatigue specifically. Do you have access to demographic groups for the doctors? Can any of this be explained by like in-group, out-group effect? And also, did you look at gender, intersections? So anything more that you can say about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do have access to demographic data from the doctors. And the sad fact is that, like the coal miners,
They mostly
they
are
were
white
all
men.
the same. So it was, I think I read that of all doctors in the US, I think 3% are black men. And it's a huge problem in so many different ways, including in a small way that we can't run those kinds of analyses.
Was there a difference by gender of the patient?
It's a great question that I think we should look at, that we didn't look at yet. But yeah, it's a really, really good question. Thank you.
Please join me and thank Ziad again.
I'll get the mic off.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you. My name is Meg Young.
Oh, hey,
I'm
Ziad.
with Data and Society, and I'm so excited about a lot of what you shared. I'd love to hear more about the containerized project, but
Yeah.
mostly I just want